Good afternoon, Mr. Q.
Good afternoon.
The last law of combat is decentralized command, allowing subordinate leaders to lead. This is fundamental to the success of any military unit or any team. Subordinate leaders need to understand the mission, the goal, the end state, the parameters they are allowed to work within, what the overall intent of the mission is, and most important, why they are doing what they are doing. Then they have to be given the authority and the autonomy to go and execute. A failure to work with this mentality is disastrous. As Hackworth explains in About Face, quote, in this, the third year of the war, whether or not to hold a pimple of a hill became an issue for the Eighth Army, the Pentagon, and sometimes the President. The only problem was that while these guys hemmed and hawed over whether to withdraw or reinforce, down at the cutting edge, American soldiers died. It would become known as centralization. End quote. Centralization does not work. Not on the battlefield, not in business, not in life. Leaders cannot hold the reins of command too tight. Leaders have to let their people lead. And that is a quote from the foreword of About Face by Colonel David H. Hackworth. That foreword was written by Mr. Jocko Willink. So I chose that as the introduction, highlighting a very important principle of leadership, decentralized command, because I had the opportunity to work under a leader that I believe understood this concept well in our last community that we were both a member of. And yeah, we have that individual here with us, Mr. Dwyer. Welcome to the show.
Hello there. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, glad to have you. All right.
Of course.
So we'll get this started by starting off with your gaming career or your gaming career. So let's start with when you first started gaming. When was that, and what type of games were you playing?
Oh boy. We're really gonna go that far back. So, honestly, I've been probably playing games since I can feasibly have a memory. I remember being a little kid, having a PlayStation 2 back then, playing a bunch of stupid little games like all the Lego games, all that when I was a kid. And eventually over time I guess that evolved into um, a love for shooter games, especially I remember playing all the Call of Duties over and over and over again, especially Call of Duty 1 through 3, those classics. um, and then inevitably it kind of led me to games like Battlefield and such, which I think in terms of my gaming history, I think that's what I guess starts to stand out in terms of memory is back in the days of middle school, um, when I basically just live on Battlefield on the Xbox 360 and later on Xbox One. Um, and as we'll get into, that's kind of where my love for, I guess, Milsim and military history and all of that potentially evolved from, along with obviously growing up. The military had always obviously been kind of ingrained into my young little brain, whether it be from conversations with family and such, and kind of just fueled a lot of my passions and desires. Not that I personally served any time in our armed service, but it just kind of created a passion in that space, at least in terms of history and knowledge and such. But I guess to segue back to the gaming thing, at least most of my, I guess, gaming experience throughout my time mostly evolves around the Milsim communities and whatever platform I'm in. For whatever reason, that's really what's drawn me into gaming, and that's what I continuously go back to, no matter how many times I try to leave it. Um, and I would have to attribute that initial itch probably to Battlefield 4 on the the Xbox back in those days. And it all started out with me joining a Milsim unit unintentionally, called First Marine Division, which if any of you have any, I guess, experience from those days, they were a pretty big group. In there, I probably influenced a lot of my trajectory of what I focused a lot of my gaming experience around, and is really, like I previously stated, ingrained that Milsim mindset into my head, and what inevitably led to the development of leadership principles and such, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But I guess in that space, Battlefield 4, yeah, that was much of my childhood. Thousands and thousands and thousands of hours on that game. So yeah.
Very nice. When I had a conversation with the Academy's podcast with Iceman, he also stated that he got his start in Battlefield. I don't know if it was the same one, but he said that's where he got his start, and then he then transitioned into the Arma world. So that seems to be a gateway drug for, I guess, some people early on. I don't know if it still is. People just get right into games like Squad or Arma or any of the other Milsim games, but yeah, it's interesting that people are starting out there because I did not. I just jumped straight into stuff like Squad.
Yeah, I think it largely has some part to do to the fact of barrier of entry, because obviously, I don't know, 10 years ago, PCs weren't as popular as they are now, and obviously with Arma and Squad being games on that platform, it wasn't very much of a open option for people who obviously didn't really have a computer or the funding to get a computer, especially young children that don't have a feasible income to pay for something like that. So I think that's partially why, like, at least what I've noticed when it comes to a lot of like older Milsim players, a lot of them have roots in games like that or something similar, whether it be GTA 5, surprisingly, doing Milsim, and other games. There's, sure, I could, if I really sat down and tried to list them out, there's a couple other games on console platforms. But no, at a certain point, I got my computer and immediately jumped into the Arma 3 space. Probably way too overconfident with myself, with the quote experience that I had gained through Battlefield 4, which is a completely different beast, which I'm sure we'll get into going forward. And but no, yeah, I definitely do see that correlation myself, with the amount of people that I've talked to. How I've even just talked to some people recently that were even in that unit that I started out in, which is just kind of mind-boggling. Like 15 years later, however long it was, that I'm still running into those people.
Yeah. So I want to backtrack. So you said you started off doing some Call of Duty stuff like FPS. Not really. Well, depending on your definition of Milsim, sure. But not really Milsim. It's more of just like a running gun type game. Then you transition to the Battlefield games. And you said you accidentally landed yourself into a Milsim oriented Marine Division group. Can you, I guess, go into how you accidentally landed yourself into that type of group and what that initial experience was like for you?
Honestly, it was completely out of left field. I didn't really understand it at the time. Um, had really no experience with it. But essentially, one day I was just playing in somebody's server, and someone happened to message me, because that was kind of the methodology of recruiting for that type of group, was getting a direct message from someone on the server that was involved in the community. And essentially, I got into a voice chat, and they're like, hey, we're part of this group. We play more organized, and we do events and stuff like that. We're a large community. We have over 100 players, and we're doing events on a weekly basis and all that, and I was like, wow, people actually do try to do like organized play on this. Essentially, what I thought was just Call of Duty with more mechanics, essentially. And I was like, I guess I'll give it a shot, and I showed up for a boot camp for that, and oh boy, compared to what I would establish as a standard for a community like that nowadays, to then, it was definitely an experience. Hopping in and running around Battlefield, trying to employ small unit tactics to the best of our abilities, and medical doctrine to the best of our abilities, and all that wonderful stuff. And I was like, wow, this is a culture shock in some aspect when it comes to the gaming stuff. And that's kind of what got me hooked. I ended up doing a couple of events with them, and I was just like, wow, these are some like well put together group of guys for what they're trying to do. Really well organized. We had designated squad structures and platoon structures, and you had a squad leader and a team leader, much like you would in a normal Milsim community. But looking back on it, thinking about it in Battlefield 4, it is questionable of how well that really worked out with the systems that we had, at least with the communication systems. Back in the day, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Zello. It's
Oh, Zello.
yeah, yep. It's an app on your phone for, I guess, those of you who don't know, that essentially simulates a half duplex radio, where only one person can talk on the radio at a given time, and essentially it's a little app that you'd use on your phone, and we'd have all the leadership involved on the Zillow app to communicate from like squad to platoon level communication, and then all of the individual squads would essentially correlate into a party, and it was surprisingly more organized than you would think, with 10 people in a party chat trying to do Milsim gameplay with no like communication like management in any regard like you would have with VoIP with a lot of modern games, where it's a lot harder to just talk over people and create complete chaos with communication. But surprisingly, it worked out good enough to where it was an entertaining experience. And yeah, no, and honestly, surprisingly, operations on a game like that obviously are more, I guess, akin to a squad type environment where it's PvP. But we had a good group of leadership and staff there that, through that PvP, still ingrained quite an interesting story dynamic to it that really hooked you. And everyone felt like they're involved in some capacity in this overarching story. But then there was also the other side of it that one thing I will forewarn is that the Battlefield 4 like Milsim community was very toxic because of that PvP aspect, to the point where you had groups intentionally starting beef and drama with each other so they could prove their worth and fight each other in each other's servers. I remember, as I previously mentioned, the group that I was a part of happened to be one of the larger communities in the overall Battlefield community. I think at its height had like 600 individuals within our roster. We had like 2 different companies that operated on different time schedules, to the point where we had some very toxic leadership that were notoriously known in the community for just starting shit just to prove ourselves by going and filling up our quote enemy servers for 7 days straight with zero like pause in between, and we just hammer people until they essentially gave up through attrition. It was an experience nonetheless, and it definitely, I will say that part of me misses that type of environment and dynamic when it comes to the Milsim side of things, because at least nowadays, a lot of, at least in the Arma 3 space of things, it's not necessarily more PvP focused. It's It's a lot more PvE focused. So when it comes to, I guess, really testing your grit, you don't really get as much opportunity to test against real life people. Obviously, there are those communities that do that, but at least in the space of the realism space, it's not so much like that. So it is definitely a completely different dynamic. I guess the closest thing to it is Squad, if you really want to fill that itch, by far. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I got into that.
So, what was it that made it stick for you? It made it seem, well, it seems like it was just the structure, like the fact that you go from this, I guess, it's not really a single player experience, but like you're just a lone guy, you just join a server and then you just like play, you're not attached to any sort of like community, you just like go on and do your thing. And then when you join a community like what you did there, you start seeing that, oh wait, you can actually have some structure and tactics, techniques, procedures to like all this chaos. um so I'm just curious about why you liked it and why you decided to stick with Milsim starting from that point.
I think part of it probably just comes from my self-diagnosed OCD. But I don't know, something about structure and organization really does a lot for me to make a more enjoyable experience. And at least from my experience doing the Milsim community, the only way to really run a successful community in that space is to have some semblance of organization and structure. But it definitely is probably what hooked me is being a part of a community like that, where everything was more organized. And another thing that kind of hooked me is I in these communities a lot of I guess sense of brotherhood is pretty common or commonplace to see in a lot of these communities, because a lot of these groups put a lot of work into practicing with one another, and you a lot of the time are put into a team where you're regularly working with guys and proving yourselves as a team, and that does a lot to breed a certain level of camaraderie where, I mean, I myself, and I've talked to other people obviously who've had similar, I guess, experience in the fact that, I mean, I've definitely made some pretty close friends in the Milsim community that I could argue, I am in a certain level closer to than some of my real life friends, through the camaraderie that I've had over the years. But no, I think a lot of it just comes from even just that sense of camaraderie and brotherhood, um, to a certain extent, that is probably one of the few places on the internet that I've really experienced that sort of, I guess, environment or community aspect. And that definitely is probably one of the biggest things that draws me to it to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's fair. When I first started, like I mentioned, I was in Squad. I was just joining servers, just doing my thing. And then I ended up joining a server that was attached to a Milsim group. And then I guess I had like a similar type of situation where I noticed that, oh, there's these groups of people that take this more seriously. They provide the structure. There's like this bond being formed from training and whatnot. And I mean, this was earlier on in Squad, so there weren't as many cool things as there are currently that are implemented. But we were still like doing a bunch of really neat stuff. And I mean, everything that we were doing Milsim wise was brand new. Well, TTP wise. Um, and I just loved it. And that, I mean, that's what got me hooked. And then I
Yeah,
just kept going. But yeah,
I can definitely understand that.
yeah. Um, so you start off with that Marine division. What was the leadership like? You mentioned that there was some toxic leadership in there, but was there? I guess overall, like, what was the leadership like? Did you like learn anything good, or anything bad from that, I guess, your time there?
Honestly, from that community, I wouldn't necessarily say that I developed my current leadership ethos or ideology, if that's the correct way to describe it. Um, to be honest, as organized as it was such a large group to where there were, for lack of a better way to describe it, cliques between the different internal subordinate units, the internal cultures, even from platoon to platoon, company to company, and how they did things and stuff were definitely there was differences, and I mean that's something you can see in parallels in real life. When you get to groups of that size, you start to see internal cultures start to be bred and differentiation there, obviously. Um, I will say in that community, I'm not proud of it, but I was very young and inexperienced and didn't really understand things. And I will say I probably was a pretty brown-nosing young individual back then because very quickly, despite my age back then, I was probably like 12 or 13 or something like that. I still, I guess, grew within that unit in terms of, uh, I guess, my positioning. Mostly just because, honestly, by sheer luck, I ended up getting into like the inner circle of the overall command of the group, just by happenstance of essentially one operation. The headquarters medic wasn't around, and they needed someone to fill in for that. And they're like, "Hey, back then I used to go by blood, so we won't go by that anymore. But uh, blood, get over here. We need medical support." And ended up following the command staff around, providing them aid for their operation. And I don't know, they kind of took me on as the little mascot or protege or whatever you want to call it, and I just followed them around. And I will say that that kind of put me outside of those internal cliques that were happening in the companies and stuff, and put me more into the headquarters clique. And I will say it kind of opened my eyes to kind of what goes into having to try and start one of these communities and kind of how some of the organization works. But like I said earlier, there was some toxic leadership. So I would say that in terms of mentorship and leadership ethos, it probably wasn't a great environment for that. But it was an interesting experience. By the time I finished with that unit, essentially, I was with that unit for probably 2 or 3 years, probably, I want to say, if I recall correctly. I actually stayed with them until they split apart. As I said, with the toxic leadership, the CO and XO at a certain point started butting heads themselves and created a schism in the unit, where basically half the unit kind of identified with one of the leaders and the other half didn't, and it really created some internal strife. I was one of the poor, unfortunate souls that was trying to just keep everyone together, but when you have a 600-man group like that, with that many people splitting apart, and one individual can't really make much of a difference in that regard, unfortunately, especially with me being so young. I don't think that was very helpful in that instance. But I stayed with them for quite a while. I think by the end of it, I left that community as a more of a platoon sergeant equivalent position, um, which baffles me that they would even give me the authority over like 30 or 40 people when I was like 13. And it baffles me that people even listened to me at that point, because I definitely was young and very inexperienced. So I honestly couldn't tell you how I got there. But well, I left that community. I ended up starting a community of my own, um, which kind of opened the door to kind of my, I guess, inherent magnetic pull towards running these communities rather than necessarily being one of the, for lack of better terms, cogs in the machine, I guess. I don't know a better way to describe it right now. Better words don't come to mind. But yeah, so it's
Uh,
kind of where it was with that.
okay, so you leave there, and then you eventually work your way towards creating your own community. Was that still in Battlefield, or was that in another game?
So I off and on ran a community in the Battlefield space on Xbox for probably 2 years, I want to say. Um, I till I was probably 15 or 16 is probably when that was occurring. And I will say, by no means was I in any way experienced enough of a leader to where I would have, like, looking back at it now, I definitely shouldn't have been trying to split off and do my own thing at that time. I did not have enough experience under my belt and just leadership experience and knowing how to work with people and create a core of leadership to really support what I was trying to do. Um, Nonetheless, I mean, I still built a sizable community of like 40 to 50 guys in that space. We did theme ourselves as a Raider Battalion. That was what the group was. But I did that off and on for 2 years, give or take, and then eventually, as a young lad, I saved up enough money to buy a computer, and that's kind of the gateway of how I got into Arma. As soon as I got the only reason I bought a computer was quite literally just to play Arma from watching videos and stuff because I was so ingrained in Milsim at that point. I was constantly looking for what is the next best platform, essentially. And even to this day, I mean, I still am constantly looking for a potentially better platform than Arma to do what it does, but unfortunately, nothing has quite come to its capabilities to really foster the communities that we have on Arma, at least.
Yeah. So, one really important thing that you mentioned before was that you probably shouldn't have been the one starting up and running a community at those times because of your, lack of experience or whatever. Um, I've noticed this often. Everyone here probably has. Of you have communities being ran by individuals that you're wondering why are they running a community, um, and it's either because like they're just inexperienced, they're very young, whatever. And I know that's a really important lesson. Is that oftentimes to just start a venture, you don't have to be the best to do it. Like all you have to do is just start, and
For
then
sure.
and then you could just learn on the way. Because like what you mentioned, you weren't the best individual for the role. Like you weren't, I don't know, 50 years old with all sorts of military experience and like all this stuff. Like you just spent 2 to 3 years in this unit before in the Battlefield 4 with Marine Division, and then you're like, hey, I'm just gonna spin up a unit, and you did. Like that's all it takes to get started. Uh, sometimes you might want a bit more experience than what you had. It might help you out, but you grew it, and it didn't just fail. You said you were doing it on and off for a couple years, so yeah, I think that's something that's really important to take away. One thing to take away from that is that you don't have to be the best to get started. You just have to be the one that wants to get started, and then
For
just
sure.
get better as you go. Um, but
Yeah, to
yeah,
touch upon that, I mean, I will say that there is no better teacher than failure. I've started up my fair share of communities, especially in the Milsim space, over the years, and some of them have lasted longer than others. I mean, some of them are still even around to this day, past me even running them. And I will say that for the amount of units that I've started that have ultimately just flopped. Realistically, the only true way, and I guess to touch upon what you're saying, to really learn is just by doing so. But it also definitely helps with surrounding yourself with people who do have experience to help guide you in the direction of success. And I will say having a good, I guess, coterie of experienced individuals definitely does leaps and bounds towards, I guess, improving your chances of success for the long term. But no, I definitely do agree. There's no better way to really get that experience than just jumping into the deep end of that pool for sure. Um, One thing I will say is I do wish a lot of these more inexperienced people that I do see at least starting up units were a little more open-minded in certain aspects and being given suggestions or listening to other people, their experience. Obviously, there are people like that, but at least in the Arma 3 community, I do come across a lot of groups that are very much set in their way of well, their way, and aren't open to outside perspective.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I mean that's why there's a high attrition rate when it comes to Arma communities. It's because of that, amongst other reasons. But I guess not just Arma, just Milsim communities, or I guess any online gaming community. To be honest, they get spun up, and the leader just doesn't have the right characteristics to make it work in the long run, or maybe even in the short run. Um, and having that open mindedness, the willingness to be incorrect and to fail, and to put themselves out there as like someone that did fail, but they're willing to learn from the failure. A lot of people aren't willing to do that. Um, but yeah, I mean, when you're new and you're young and you don't have the experience, you have to compensate for that in other ways. And by being open minded and being a sponge is how you compensate for it. If you're new and young and you don't know a lot and you're not willing to accept input from other people, you're going to fail. But if you're willing to be a sponge and learn, and be open minded, then that will surely help you in your efforts. But I mean, of course, you want all of it. You want to be really experienced, and you also want to be a sponge. But not everyone's in that boat.
No, I agree. I mean, realistically, you're always learning something new. I mean, don't know everything. I by no means claim that I know everything, especially in the Milsim space. I mean, like I brought up previously, I by no means have a service record in the real world. So when it comes to employing TTPs and all that stuff to try and emulate the groups that we're trying to do, a lot of that comes with being open to those that do have that experience to really influence how we do things, obviously. Um, and I would say that probably my most successful groups that I've run have largely just been due to the fact that I was able to get those supporting elements of people to really influence communities for the better. Um, but no, I definitely agree. I mean, a lot of that concept even applies to really any organization, even in the business space. Like jumping back into the just tr- trying things, even if you don't have the experience, and not letting failure get to you, and just continuing to try until you do succeed. It's probably just never quit.
Yeah.
I guess the moral of that story. Um, but no, I did those points.
Yeah. Um, yeah. It definitely does correlate. It's compatible, or that way, or that principle, or those principles are compatible with the business world, because I'm doing it right now with a business that I'm trying to, well, I guess not really trying, that I'm working to make successful. But yeah. So, anyways, so you create this unit, this raider unit. You do it on and off. you said that it kind of solidified your desire to prefer, or I guess to gravitate towards leadership roles, like being the owner of these units versus being a member. How did that, I guess, come about when you spun up or were running that Raider unit?
I think a lot of it was more so my inherent desire to provide people with an experience and be a provider or a fosterer of, I guess, providing people with entertainment as well as a community to really develop as an individual and also just a community to make friends and such. I've definitely always gravitated towards the leadership more so. I guess it comes a lot with my personality. I'm a pretty outspoken individual who um, likes to teach and likes to help people develop into the best person they can develop into, assuming they're open to, I guess, my instruction or teachings or experiences. Um, I think that is partially to do with why I've gravitated so much towards leadership is I don't know. I guess I inherently have a natural affinity to help instruct and teach and guide other individuals within the space. And it also comes to having pride in building something as well. Like, as much as pride is a sin, I suppose, I do take quite a lot of pride in building an organization that can be successful. And like I said, I've built a couple of groups that have even lasted past my administration, and I still take great pride that those groups are still around to this day, despite me not being involved. But I think that's potentially a big reason why I gravitated so much towards the leadership side of things. Um, and back then, it also probably had to do. I used to be a lot more of a stubborn individual than I am these days. I mean, I won't lie, still have my occasional, uh, I guess, mishaps of falling back into being a stubborn individual, but I try to actively um, be open-minded and conscious about it nowadays, knowing that uh, I don't know everything, and in all reality, there's always something new to learn. And I think that was also a part of why I gravitated so much towards leadership, is because I was set in. I originally started out in the mindset of how I do things is the way to do things. And I think that's what initially started that. But over the years, like I said, throughout my experience, I've definitely learned that that is not the way to go about running a successful group like that. Um, and I guess comes back to those learning experiences, learning from failure, and really breaking down what truly led to failure in whatever venture that I have. I try to be pretty analytical and what's the word, introspective. Is that the correct term for that?
I believe so.
Yes, I do think so.
Of how I do things and be critical and trying to understand why when I do have failures, why those have occurred, so that way going forward in the future I can hopefully address those and fix those mistakes going forward. But
Yeah.
I think that answers your question.
Yeah, it most definitely did. But yeah, I think that introspection, the honest introspection after experiencing something, whether it was a success or a failure, especially if it was a failure, is important. Because I remember after Task Force, what was it? Was it Nova? Is it Nova was the most recent one, I believe, or was it Nightfall was the most recent one?
No, Nova was the reason.
Okay, so it was with Nightfall. When Nightfall crumbled, I remember being in a call with I guess the two owners, Raider and Hunter, at the time, and I was telling them, hey, you guys should open up like a Google Doc and write down basically like your lessons learned from that experience. Like, don't give too much control to people that you shouldn't give it to, or, I mean, all the different lessons that they learned from that initial, I guess, failure. And I think that helped them in their second iteration. I mean, the second iteration ended up also failing, but they definitely did a lot of things better the second time than they did the first time. I think it was partially due to them like sitting down and going through like their first experience running that community, and then yeah, just trying not to repeat the bad stuff, and repeat the good stuff. So yeah, when you fail, writing down or like parsing through your lessons is very, very important, or else you'll likely just do it again, and that's no fun.
No, I definitely agree. It's definitely a good tool to, like we said, be introspective, writing down what failures you had, and then I guess to accompany that, also try to write how to address that failure and move past it for success in the future. I think that's also an important aspect of it.
Hmm. Okay, so you spent some time at that Raider unit for a couple of years. You said on and off. Then you bought yourself a shiny PC, and you entered the PC world. Um, from there, did you go straight to Arma, or did you go to like other games?
Straight to Arma. It's the first purchase I made. Honestly, and I somewhat regret it originally because it probably would have helped jumpstart my learning curve and getting into Arma Milsim because, as I mentioned earlier, it's completely different beast from Battlefield, in terms of how those communities are managed and run, from both the server side of things to just general management, um, in regards to it. Um, and me being, I guess, the arrogant young kid I was, I thought I already had all the answers and that I was ready to just jump into the beast and start an Arma community. And boy, oh boy, did it fail. I think it lasted a total of 2 weeks before it completely crashed and burned because I had zero experience in putting together a server and understanding how a lot of the logistics behind creating a functioning server and mod list, and then also the logistics of how to like organize a successful Arma community, both within the communication space because it's a way different beast than Battlefield. As I mentioned, we're in Xbox Live parties connected through Zello, or in the Arma space you have actual VoIP and radios. So it was definitely a completely different experience that I thought I had already all the answers to, and definitely jumped into it a little preemptively without either getting that experience somewhere first and learning what goes into managing these communities, or alternatively even just studying into it. I didn't really do much of that myself, but I ended up starting this community with a friend of mine who also ended up buying a PC simultaneously with me to get into this. Um, and I still even keep in touch with that guy to this day. He's not really in Arma anymore. He ended up enlisting in the Marine Corps, and that's where much of his time is, obviously. So, but yeah, so I ended up starting this group. It crashed and burned, and through him, I got some connections with other people who had the experience that I lacked, and I, instead of going and getting the experience myself, decided I would just try it again, just in a different space, I suppose. Originally, I started up basically, I tried to do what my initial experience on Battlefield was, and I started the first Marine Division for Arma. Um, and it did not pan out, obviously. Another thing with me, I'm like to say I'm a sci-fi nerd, so I get into Star Wars and all that, and I've done my fair share in those communities. So after I guess that first Marine Division, the Star Wars mod came out for Arma, and I was one of the first people to jump on building a community for that. And I guess we can get into my failures in that community now. But so yeah, I ended up starting a unit called the 21st Nova Corps, the Star Wars theme. Honestly, I'm surprised I'm even bringing this up because I don't even like to talk about those days very much anymore, just because the stigma that surrounds that community is pretty toxic. So I try to avoid it. Um, but I ended up starting up this unit. We very quickly grew to being within like the top 3 largest communities in the, I guess, Star Wars space of Arma 3. And it largely came down to being in the right place at the right time, I suppose. When that community, I guess, when that mod initially released, um, a lot of people obviously flocked to their Discord to kind of connect with other people in that community rather than like the Arma 3 Discord. Um, and at the time, if I guess you look at the rise in player base for Arma 3, there's a huge spike in new players coming to Arma 3 as well because of it from the Gmod space, because there's a lot of people doing communities on there around the Star Wars community, and then a lot of them migrated over to Arma, which I will say is probably a huge attributor to why that community is so toxic on Arma as well. But yeah, so I hopped on board with that really quick, and I was the reason I grew to be like the 3rd largest community in that space was because I found a recruiting avenue that not many groups had figured out yet. And what me and my friend did, well, I guess I'll backtrack. Originally, I started this group. It was for like 2 weeks. It was really small, but since we were one of the first communities, there was 2 already kind of established groups, 501st and 212th, that had a pretty big following immediately, just because those are recognizable groups from the uh, the world, I guess, or the what's the word I'm looking for?
The
Star
Star
Wars.
Wars universe?
Yeah, the Star Wars universe. I don't know why that was hard for me, but so like they quickly grew, and on top of that, they also had some YouTubers and streamers associated, which really helped attribute to their growth. But they ended up forming a community of units where they were trying to collect other groups to do joint operations and stuff. And since I was one of the first communities, they approached me, despite me being tiny and insignificant at the immediate start. And part of the requirements for being a part of this group was you had to have like 30 or 40 people in your unit. And so me and my second in command at the time, who I had met through my friend in that first unit that I started and failed, really quickly had to brainstorm a method of growing our group from like 10 to 15 guys to 40 people overnight, because we essentially had 2 days before we had to sit down at a meeting with all these guys, and we're like, what can we do to grow this community? And so we decided that we're going to go through the list of people in the Discord and just DM them, hey, we see that you're into Star Wars. Have you ever considered joining a Arma 3 unit in the Star Wars space? We run this group, yada, 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 typical recruitment pitch. And overnight, it grew from 10 people to like 65 within a period of 24 hours. And I will tell you, looking back at the time, I thought that was amazing. But looking back at it, that was probably the worst thing I could have done, largely due to the fact that with groups like that, at least when you have numbers like that, you need to have experienced leadership in those lower level leadership positions to manage these people and influence them in a positive manner. Otherwise, you either get disorganized chaos because you can't find experienced leaders to manage all these people, or you start to get toxic personalities in positions that they really leverage and abuse, and eventually a lot of the time it leads to internal conflict within your group when you have people like that in positions like that. Long story short, that unit ended up failing because it grew too large for itself, and I did not have enough experienced leaders to really manage this, and I had a lot of internal issues with conflicts of personality between some toxic leaders that I put in position. Ultimately caused that unit to crash and burn because of some internal strife caused by that. And that, I would say, is one of the biggest lessons I learned is you can grow a group like this way too quickly, especially if you grow them from a top-down perspective rather than a bottom-up perspective. At least in my experience, I've had 10 times more success starting from the bottom and growing upwards, putting myself in, I guess, a team lead position and going up as I built out those elements with experienced leaders to place beneath me, where, at least in my experience, from a top-down perspective, a lot of units I've seen doing it end up ultimately failing because they don't have those experienced leaders to place beneath them. And ultimately, it does lead to a lot of failures, at least from my experience. And that was a major lesson that I learned from that. As well as I also learned stay away from that community because there's a lot of toxic people there. But after that, I said, screw it, I'm gonna go back to the modern space of things. I ran my first iteration of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion on Arma 3. That was a decent community. We lasted a few months. I think the biggest problem with it is following that failure with my previous community. I still didn't quite understand how to develop leadership to fill out those lower level leadership positions. I identified that that was the problem. I just didn't really have a solid method of either identifying good leaders to put in positions like that or essentially building good leaders to put in those positions. And that ultimately probably led to that group's failure. And then I guess after that, I don't mean to kind of rush through a lot of this stuff because a lot of these groups are kind of just groups that I don't necessarily like to associate as like pillars of my success, quote unquote, in my leadership ethos. But by any means, if you want to stop and talk about any of these groups I go through, feel free to stop me and I can talk a little more in depth. But after that, like I said, I've always been into a lot of sci-fi communities, and at a certain point, or not sci-fi communities, but sci-fi universes, I'm also a fervent fan of the 40K genre and universe. And eventually the 40K mods dropped, and I ended up starting a unit on there called the 143rd Death Corps of Krieg Siege Regiment. And that unit also very quickly grew to the largest Death Corps themed unit in that space. We very quickly outbeat our competitors. At that point, I still didn't really understand how to develop solid leadership. But one thing I did have going for me through my failures in my previous groups, I started to collect more experienced people who would follow me. And that unit had a lot more success, largely in fact that I had collected enough experienced people to really help me man a lot of those leadership positions, at least within the lower echelons of leadership. That community ended up growing. It was by far the largest community I ever run. At its height, it had like around 250 people. We had regularly 80-man operations, huge combined arms operations. We had multitude of different detachments. We had an armor detachment, aviation detachment, a mobile scout detachment. We had 2 infantry platoons and like a whole company organization. It was by far probably one of the coolest, more line infantry style experiences I've had in the Milsim space. Seeing 80 guys come together using combined arm tactics to execute operations successfully. It was definitely a really cool experience. However, since I didn't fully understand how to identify and develop those leaders beneath me, I came back to having that initial issue that I had with that Star Wars group, where at a certain point, I put people into positions that had personality issues, and that ultimately led to the downfall of that. Well, I can't say the downfall of that group because that group is still alive to this day. They are no longer as large as they were, largely just because that community of that universe, I suppose, the 40K community in Arma, isn't as nearly as big as it used to be. And what ended up happening with my group there is I had a very toxic individual who created a lot of internal problems that at a time in my life I was going through a lot of stuff in my personal life, and it created a lot of stress for me. So I ended up handing the unit over to someone else because I just couldn't keep up with the stress of it. Honestly, if I stayed in charge of the unit, it probably would have fell apart because I didn't remove those individuals. And luckily, the guy that I ended up putting in charge after me was able to identify those flaws and make up for my mistakes. And that community, from last I checked, is still around to this day. So props to them. But these, I guess, to get to the real reason why I'm going through all these groups is they were really my failures that ultimately influenced a lot of my methodology and I guess ethos in how I go about building these units, like I said, from the bottom up rather than a top-down perspective, and really focusing on developing people to put beneath me before jumping the gun and overexpanding myself. I think that is a huge, I guess, factor when it comes into growth of groups like this, at least from my experience. I could be wrong. I'm sure other groups have had their success in growing communities other ways, but that's always been my method of doing so that I've had success, at least. But after that, I guess we get into the unit that I most identify with as being, I guess, my most successful group that I've ever run. And that is the second and final iteration of 2nd Marine Raider Battalion that I ran in the Arma 3 community. I ran that unit for close to 6 years. I spent a long time really developing out that group and building a very capable, committed community of guys that wanted to get on and work is really what it was. But I guess, I mean, I don't know if you want to change the topic up a little bit and ask any other questions, or I can go into, I guess, the history of that unit and such.
I want to say that there's a variety of, like, listening to you go through these different units that you started up and you learning different things about how to run like these online communities, learning more about yourself in the process, learning about like what you're good at, what you're not so good at probably, and identifying these problems and just like iteratively getting better, unit from unit. There's, I think I don't know, you just have to do stuff in order to get better.
I agree.
You can't escape it. I think a lot of people, I mean, I am very guilty of this, but Like you read a lot of books, you watch a lot of videos, you do all this stuff and you're like, oh yeah, I'm prepared. I don't really think there's any I guess replacement from actually doing it. You could have read all sorts of leadership books and all sorts of random stuff. Um but it would not have been as valuable as you going through and running those different communities. Um, so either you doing it through running the communities like what you did. I didn't go that route. Um, I learned my lessons through. Well, I'm learning my lessons through like other ways, but like it just depends on who you are. Like if instead of running communities, maybe you just like being a member in communities. You just are trying to be the best. I don't know. I don't know. The best pilot that you could be in like these type of games. Um, Still having that same mentality. Like you join your first unit as a pilot, you're terrible. You join your second one, you're also terrible, but you're a little bit better. And then you progressively just keep getting better. In all of the different ways, you still have to like put in time and learn in the real. I mean, it's not really real world because it's like in a game, but like you actually have to apply it. Um,
Trial and error.
yeah, and that's something that's really important that I personally have to remind myself often. Because I like to just read and watch podcasts and um, I don't know, just learn from that. And I think I got it. Well, I think I have it a little bit better, which I do. But no matter what, you still have to like do it to just get very good at it. So, although those are just minor parts in your journey, I think that they're very pivotal. Because without those, you wouldn't have been able to do like the second iteration of the Marine Raider Battalion, where you have this better, I guess, product that you built out. Um, yeah, I just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, yeah,
But
no, I definitely agree that I those were definitely pivotal learning experiences that I had getting to where I'm at, and by far, honestly, if that didn't happen that way, I likely wouldn't be where I'm at least in terms of the successes I did have. Um, but no, I definitely agree with that outlook.
yeah, that's I'm trying to adopt more of the instead of trying to try and know everything that I possibly can before getting started doing something. I'm trying to know just enough. That's where I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to get in that type of mindset where, all right, Zach, I just need to know just enough, and then I could get started, and then the rest I could just learn on the way. Instead of being like, oh, I want to run this online community. I need to know how to like lead people. I need to know how to recruit. I need to know how to do marketing. I need to know how to run these servers. And then you could be studying that for years before you're like, okay, time to start. And the opportunity could have already passed. So just knowing enough to begin and then having, I guess, what we talked about before, like having some good leadership characteristics will just help you go forward. But
For sure.
you know,
I mean, even to this day, I'm still learning how to do a lot of those aspects better and better and better continuously. And it goes back to realistically that you can always improve in whatever space you're trying to work in. And there's always room for improvement. You're always learning. Um, so and being open to learning as well is also a big part of what comes to, I guess, fixing your failures or your flaws. Because ultimately, there's also people who will continuously make the same mistakes because realistically not being open to why they failed to begin with, and then they get into that cycle of repetition. But but yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with you on that aspect.
so let's get into this second chunk here. Um, I guess we stopped in this second iteration of the Second Marine Raider Battalion. If you wanted to just keep rolling with that experience for you.
So yeah, that unit is what I deem probably one of my largest successes in the Milsim community. As I said, it ended up living on. It technically is still around to this day, but they've rebranded since then and do different things now at this point. Um, but while I ran it, it was called Second Marine Raider Battalion. We uh, advertised and branded ourselves in the realism space, so we tried to very heavily model ourselves off of all the information we could soak up in regards to the Raider battalions, from reading books to talking to people who've worked in that space, and trying to gather every bit of information so we could try and emulate this unit to the best of our ability as closely as possible. And in that unit is kind of where I started to develop uh, a lot of my drive towards trying to build communities that value quality and training and cohesion and developing an environment around that. Um, at its beginning, that is very much what that unit was designed to do. Is is to value training, cohesion, and professionalism in the space that we were doing. And as I guess I'll go through this group's history, towards the end, it shifted away from that. Um, and I'll get into that. But yeah, so that unit, I met some of my closest online friends through that community, that I still talk to this day. I've even met some of them in real life and now can call them my real life friends at this point. How I've even a couple of my friends from the UK came and visited me from that community, which is kind of mind boggling that I was able to build those kind of relationships there. And like I said, that goes back to why I love these communities so much, because they breed such a element of brotherhood a lot of the time between its members. Um, but so yeah, I initially founded this group. Through my failures, I had finally collected a group of individuals that had a similar, like-minded approach to wanting to build a group that took itself truly seriously. And we did everything we could to implement proper TTPs in the space that we're trying to emulate, with us being a Raider unit. It was very direct action focused. Um, as well as we implemented unconventional warfare practices to the best of our ability in Arma, at least to what I could at the time, with how I could figure to run those kinds of mission sets. Nowadays, I have a different approach to trying to emulate that mission set, which we can go into in a little while. But um, but yeah, so we've really just heavily focused on small unit tactics around a small team of guys who really wanted to work together to become as capable as we could with such a small force, and become a force multiplier in with those numbers, by utilizing uh, small unit tactics to our best of our ability, and also creating a force multiplier with our supporting elements. We had uh, some pretty capable JTACs attached to the group that influenced our air to ground procedures pretty well. And we started to build up an aviation section that started to become pretty good in that space. I will say that over time, especially nowadays, I've experienced way better, I guess, groups within that space. But for the time of the knowledge that I had accumulated, and at that period, along with the people that I had surrounded myself, it was by far the best iteration of those practices by that point. Um, but yeah, that unit was, like I said, around for 5 years. For the longest time, we organized ourselves into, well, within the Raider battalions, you have your battalion, and then underneath that, you got the various companies. There's typically four of them in the battalions, and then uh, underneath that, uh, or correction, 3 of them. And then underneath that, we had the Marine Special Operations Team, which is essentially the platoon level asset. Um, in that space of things, because it's a soft community at that point, everything's small teams and very focused on more surgical mission sets and approaches. Um, and we really tried to do our best to take the 14 guys we had and turn them into the most capable group we could. Um, that unit, over time, did develop into a company-sized element. We ended up having 2 Marine Special Operations teams, and we ended up starting to develop into, I guess, a deployment and operational tempo of deploying our guys and separating our deployment spaces into multiple AOs that these teams would specialize in handling. Um, it was really cool to see these 2 groups interact with each other, because one thing that I started to develop is more independent leaders. And I started to learn how to kind of give my lower level leadership more independence in their own leadership. And then that goes back to even your original statement, uh, where at a certain point, to be a good leader, you need to trust those beneath you to do their job, and give them room to do their job. Um, and that unit was really interesting in that aspect, because I would essentially give them company level taskings during these deployments and missions and objectives. And outside of that, they would be gathering their own intelligence and coming up with their own uh, operational planning, and essentially their own. They would build their own missions within the space. We created a completely dynamic environment where but at the time we had several Zeuses to enable this, and in order to achieve an environment like that, you do need enough mission staff to really handle that. But we deploy these 14-man teams into these areas of operation, and they would independently work and develop through this space on their own with little hand holding. They would gather all their own intelligence, uh, come up with their own taskings and their own uh, essentially their own. They would plan and coordinate and execute all their own missions with very little oversight, which I tried to emulate to the best of my ability, because a lot of these units, at least in the real world, when they're deploying into countries like this, they're a lot more independent in that regard, especially in the soft community. And so I tried to emulate that to the best of my ability, um, to what we could do in Arma, obviously. And it worked out awesome. We did a couple of deployments like this. We had 2 MSOTs, and between deployment cycles, we'd go into our training cycles and come together as a company and train to be cohesive and capable of working on a company level if necessary, and continue to work on our TTPs to keep them cohesive across the entire unit. And then when we deploy, these units would deploy independently. However, during occasions during the deployments, some of their operations and their missions kind of bled into each other's areas of operation, and they would come together and work together, especially when they had larger targets that required a larger force to handle. Um, it was an interesting experience. That unit at a certain point kind of shifted, as I brought up earlier. At a certain point, we kind of lost that focus in realism, and trying to continuously hold ourselves to those standards, at least in the Milsim space. And it largely came to me laxing up on our standards of recruitment, and the quality of people we were bringing in. And so slowly over time, our group started to become filled with more players that were looking for more of the casual experience that wasn't so training focused and cohesion focused. And over time, that player base ended up overshadowing the original player base of realism guys. And that is not what led to the downfall of the unit, but it led to the unit adopting a completely different identity of what it initially was. And um, after about 6 years of running it, um, I realized that the unit had changed so much that there really wasn't a way of going back to how it initially was, valuing training, cohesion, realism, and professionalism, without obviously basically gutting the entire team. Um, Before I came to that realization, I tried to fix these issues multiple times to get back into that higher standard of training and realism, as I mentioned, by removing individuals that were essentially contradicting the ethos that I was trying to build there, or the guiding principles of the community. But that only worked so much or went so far, um, because at a certain point, um, the I guess culture of the community just had shifted to where I would have to essentially start from ground zero to get back to that point, and build everything back up. So I realized that, all right, rather than systematically dismantling this group to try and reshape it back into what I wanted, I did the, I guess, selfless approach of gathering everyone together and going, all right, gentlemen, this is what I want. Obviously, you don't want it. So I'm going to now pass it on to someone else who would like to run this community and keep it in line with what it's evolved into. And so that's kind of where I departed from that unit after about 5 or 6 years of running it. Um, was um, essentially giving it to one of my close friends that I developed in that community who had a completely different play style from me, wanting a more casual experience. And he still runs it to this day from me keeping tabs on it. Um, but I guess the lesson I learned from that community is that if you want a community to stay in, I guess, the ethos and principles that you're founding it in, you have to limit, I guess, the individuals who are coming in who don't fit that category, because then you have, I guess, internal conflict of unit cultures occurring that will either eventually boil over and cause a schism, or alternatively, one obviously will outbeat the other. So I've from learning from that experience, I've learned better how to, um, I guess, select people to come into a group like that, um, that kind of fit the mentality that you're trying to breed within that group, and then continue to build out the unit within people who fall within that mentality. So that way, I don't come into that issue again where the internal culture of the unit ends up completely shifting on a 180. And I kind of identified a selection process to how to go about it in terms of identifying people who display the characteristics of the type of community that you're trying to build. Um, that's kind of where what leads me into what I'm doing today. Um, and But yeah, so I mean that unit, like I said, I attribute it to being a major success in the history of the communities I ran, just because um, to this day it's still a very successful community, and they still operate with one another to this day, just no longer kind of in the realism space, I suppose. I've learned a lot of lessons in regards to how to build a efficient unit with less people. Um, and I also learned a lot of lessons when it comes to delegation, and trusting leaders beneath myself. Because up to this point, another major failure that I had continuously demonstrate, or I guess another flaw that I had continuously demonstrated, which partially attributed to some of my failures in the past, was not trusting the leaders that I put beneath me to do their jobs without micromanagement or oversight. And I was very, very much uh, micromanaging way too much and overexerting myself, and which ultimately uh, essentially inhibited the amount of development that happened within that team. It would take 10 times longer for us to develop new uh, training opportunities for our guys and such, because I refuse to let anyone be involved with overseeing the development of those, because everything had to go through me, um, 'cause I was being too much of a gatekeeper at the time. Um, but through that unit, I started to learn that no, I need to start trusting my guys to be more independent thinkers so they can A, develop into better leaders themselves, but also give me alternative perspective to potentially better ways to do things. Because up until that point, I was, like I said, still very stubborn and set in my ways where things had to be done my way. And that was a, another attributing factor to a lot of my failures up till that point. So I would say that's a major lesson that I learned in regards to trusting leadership. But, and then
Yeah.
after that, that led me into B Squadron, which is kind of where I am today, somewhat. Um, well, I say somewhat because B Squadron was a group before I met you in TFN. And then after TFN, I went back to it. Um, but but yeah, so that is kind of the history of that whole organization. I could go into a lot more if you have more uh, direct questions in regards to that community. Just don't know what you would like to, I guess, go into in regards to it if you would. Of
Yeah, so I would like to go into some more detail.
course.
Okay, so I want to, I guess, unpack how you solve some of these different problems well, that you work through. Um, so you kind of touched on it first with the delegation and trusting people. I have a book on my bookshelf over there, my impromptu bookshelf called like the five dysfunctions of a team by Patrick Lencioni or something like that. And one of the dysfunctions is trust. And someone that I respect greatly, and I'm sure you do as well, Mr. Jocko. Um,
Yes, I do.
he, yeah, he equates a lot of different things to ego, but definitely that trust problem is an ego problem. And I mean, there's some nuances and there's some different things that go into it, but um, can you, I guess, talk about how you made that change of feeling that you needed to do the work in order for it to get done on time or for it to get done correctly, and then how you went from that to being able to trust the people that, I guess, like you said, the leaders that you placed beneath you?
I think a big thing that really opened my eyes was the fact that I was very slow to implement change because everything had to go directly through me. So whenever we would find that there were flaws and methods that of how we were doing things, um, there would be a large gap in time before any major change occurred to fix those issues because everything had to be gone through me directly and basically directly overseen by me. And I didn't trust other people to kind of delegate to essentially do things because I wanted everything to be exactly the way I envisioned it, when in reality, that is not necessarily a beneficial way of going about trying to create a successful community, at least. Because in all reality, you got to hamper your expectations that if you want things to get done in a feasible and manageable amount of time, you need to delegate certain things to other individuals. Otherwise, at a certain point, you collect so much on your plate that it severely inhibits the speed that you can do a lot of these things. And furthermore, on top of that, delegating, learning to be comfortable with delegation also opens yourself to the opportunity of getting insights from others in which you initially did not think of, um, because outside perspective. That goes back to that whole thing that we discussed earlier. So I think where I started to see a major shift in my mentality with it is me losing a lot of people because I wasn't making changes to fix issues that they were experiencing in any feasible or manageable amount of time uh, before I would essentially lose them. Um, and then on top of that, um, with me being set in my way, it really hampered my ability to develop my own skills and learn from other people who have other perspectives on way to do various different things. And then over time, I think what really helped me is I started surrounding myself or bringing in guys that had more experience than me. And I started over time, I guess, opening myself to listening to their experiences and realizing that, oh, wait, I actually don't know everything and I could always continue to improve. And whether or not someone else's experience actually benefit me, it's still beneficial to hear out their point of view, regardless of the situation, because you don't know. You could learn something new. Um, or alternatively, uh, if you open yourself to other points of view, it allows you to better understand um, different thought processes and why people go about doing things the way they do. And that goes back to being analytical, I guess, to help learn from your mistakes. So yeah, I think that was a contributor to my learning of like, hey, I need to start delegating a little more and trusting people. And after doing so, I started to have a lot more success because I would essentially learn new ways of doing things that I never would have otherwise thought of doing because I was so set in my way. And in doing so, I've kind of that's what essentially has shifted my, I guess, leadership ethos so much. And I mean, I won't lie, to this day, I still have my mishaps where I can get set in my ways, but I try to, like we said earlier, be introspective and correct myself when I do catch myself. And I also surround myself with a lot more guys who tell me when I'm being too, uh, I guess, stubborn and set in my ways. Because sometimes I just kind of fall into the space of not realizing that I'm doing that sometimes. So I like to try and surround myself with people who are comfortable with telling me when I'm wrong and helping me get out of my set ways, I suppose.
Yeah. For yeah, I asked that. I asked for you to like go into more detail because, well, one, someone asked me to write up a blog, or I guess like a write up about that problem exactly. Um, I've had that problem. You've had that problem. I mean, it's an, like what you just stated a couple seconds ago. Like it's still an ongoing thing that you have to just keep in check. It's not like a box that you're like, oh yeah, that problem's done. Don't have to worry about that anymore. Like it's something that can come up that you have to realize, oh, this is that problem again. I need to fix it. So so yeah, for me, I didn't really learn a lot of these lessons on the leadership side. I learned a lot of my initial lessons of leadership as a follower, or I guess as the recipient of poor leadership or of good leadership. So I got to see, oh, this is what poor leadership looks like, and this is what the impact is on the people when you're doing it, because I was those people and I saw it. Or this is very good leadership, and all of us are just happy to do the work because this guy is phenomenal.
For
But
sure.
for for this example, I remember I was in an online community, and there was a leader that it was their way or the highway, which is not good, obviously, like you just explained. And it ended up killing that community. But that was where I learned about that from my end. Um,
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, so there's this. I noticed the leader, and I was like, wait, this doesn't seem right. It just like doesn't seem right. Like when you have a leader that is, but like what you mentioned, like bottlenecking on the process. Like if you want to do something, it has to go through them. If you want to, I don't know, rise up and I don't know, like basically a whole bunch of stuff is being controlled by that one individual. And I noticed how that was just like choking the life out of the community, um,
Mhm.
because it was a combination of that and also them thinking that they have all the solutions. Um,
Yeah.
so, which I think there's a slight nuance. I think there's a little bit of a difference between those, because you can hold, like, I guess, hold on to this control because you believe you have all the solutions. So that's why I'm going to do it. Or you can hold on to the control because you don't really know how to, I guess, diversify the control. Which I think that's a better. I mean, if you're going to be making that mistake, that's a better way of making the mistake, as opposed to,
Yeah.
I know everything, so I'm just going to have everything in my court. And that was the leader that I had at that time, which I got to learn firsthand why that was not good. But then when I ended up leading, and I mean, I made the same mistake, and I started having too much control in my boat. And then also, I mean, still also noticing some other leaders. Um, I noticed that I wasn't able to properly do my role that I should be doing because I was doing other people's roles.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was something that when I was, I guess, an advisor to Raiders unit and Hunters unit, that was something that really clicked for me. Was I noticed that when you had a leader that was, I don't know, like the head of the unit or the head of the community, and they're doing the role of marketing, they're doing the role of like operations, they're doing the role of like whatever, and they're not doing what they should be doing, then it's like, okay, that's fine. But then now who is running the unit? Who is doing the stuff
Yeah.
that only you can be doing? Like who is looking up and out, thinking strategically about the unit? Because now no one is, because now you're doing marketing, now you're doing like training and stuff, which is fine, but now no one is, well, I mean, it's not fine, but now no one is doing what only you could do. So that was something that I guess clicked very recently, was that if you decide to, I guess, do
Overextend.
everything, yeah, if you decide to overextend, then you're not going to be able to properly do the role that you should be doing, which
I,
is not good.
I completely agree. And I mean, and it also comes down to even like when you become comfortable delegating like responsibility to your guys, not only is that beneficial to you, but that's beneficial to them. It's allowing them to now gain that experience to take more responsibility and develop their own leadership as well in a certain regard by taking responsibility of whatever you put them in charge of realistically. um and like I said, it goes back to even the whole space of like there could be a better way of doing that that you did not think of realistically. And that's what I have learned, especially with delegation, is it is only not just benefiting yourself, but it's benefiting those beneath you as well, realistically. And that's a good, I guess, takeaway from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, for those that want to dig deeper into that principle, um, I learned it from, well, I mean, those experiences, but then I read about it more from Jocko with his, like, as 4 laws of combat. This one is all about diversified command is what this one's about. So if you want to learn more about that, then I guess you could just Google Jocko Willink diversified command or something like that. He has all sorts of videos, but yeah, that's something that a lot of people struggle with that I wanted you to touch on. So the next topic I wanted you to touch on that people struggle with, and then we'll go on to, I guess, B Squadron, is selecting the right people. You said that in this, I guess in the second iteration of the Second Marine Battalion, Raider Battalion community that you were running, you got better at selecting the right people. Can you, I guess, talk about how, I don't know, how you got better at doing that?
So I guess what it really comes down to is identifying what characteristics will lead you towards, or character traits that will lead a person to success within whatever community you have. Because in reality, like if you have a community full of people who have character traits that don't mesh with what you're trying to, I guess, put forth as your identity, it starts to lead that community down a road away from what your vision is. So a way I go about, I guess, building up my recruiting and selection for a unit is identifying what is, I guess, the brand, what is the identity of the group that I'm trying to establish, and what kinds of people fit and enable that identity, and identifying those character traits that contribute to that. And then when you get a list of those character traits, now developing a selection process that is actually testing for those traits. So, like for an example, like I guess we can briefly touch with B Squadron and how I do it is with my selection process. I have a couple of phases, and each phase is evaluating for different characteristics. For example, our phase one, which is a land navigation assessment, or at least it's themed to be that way. On the front, looks like a land navigation assessment, but we do various different things within that land navigation assessment that require candidates to demonstrate not critical thinking, Jesus. Um, demonstrate the ability to follow directions, the ability to pay attention to detail, and as well as the ability to think for themselves and be independent in their thought process. Because how we tailored that phase of our selection is we provide them with all of the information they need to be successful. And we give them an exact format in which we want them to follow in doing so. And we tell them that this is the format in which we want. And we also make it so we don't sit there and beat it into their heads the entire time. We give it to them once, and unless they ask for it again, we don't continue to give it to them. And then throughout that selection phase, we now make them demonstrate that yes, they were paying attention by, for example, reporting procedures, having a set format for reporting procedures that they have to follow exactly to evaluate can they pay attention and follow directions? Uh, do they care to take notes? to to make sure they ensure that they're following these directions exactly as we give them. But at the same time, also only providing them what they need to know to succeed and make them uh, have to think for themselves and not handhold them and tell them what to do and how to do it all the time. Because ultimately, we are also, at least in our group, looking for people who can think for themselves and don't need micromanagement because we, at least in our community, are trying to develop a community of leaders in a sense. And that is an important character trait for a successful leader is the ability to think for yourself and not require someone to micromanage and tell you how to do it constantly. At least if you want to be a successful leader as you, I guess, go up and expand. Because as you rise in the echelons and levels of leadership, you more and more and more have to be more independent and capable of independent thought, obviously, and doing so. So that's what our first phase is very heavily focused around is identifying those three character traits: ability to pay attention to detail, follow directions, and think for yourself. Um, Very heavily. Obviously, a lot of people think we do it to evaluate land navigation. I mean, we do evaluate it in the phase, but that is essentially the last thing in the list of things we're evaluating realistically. We're looking for people who demonstrate the character traits we are looking for. And then our phase two assessment is very tailored around making them come together as a team rather than individuals to work together to solve problems. And so essentially, how we do that, we give them a mock operation that they have to execute with with basically the minimum required information and intelligence on the objective that is required to reasonably complete it. Um, and everything beyond that is on the candidates. So we make them come together and work as a team and plan their own execution of the operation. We make them come together and also and it goes back to the independent thinking as well, since we only give them what is necessary for information minimally to succeed. We also make it so they now also have to think for themselves and ask those questions and try and gather that information themselves to continue to supplement their planning process to improve their margins of success. So it makes them think on how they can tackle this. And another thing we do with it is we keep it all open ended. We tell them you can effectively execute this objective in any manner you can think of. We want out of the box thinkers that can contribute to our planning processes and offer ideas that others aren't offering because there's no bad ideas ultimately. Well, I can't say that. There are bad ideas, but giving ideas is you can never you get what I'm saying? I'm trying to come up with a way to describe it, but I'm failing with words right now. So we are looking for out of the box thinkers that want to contribute ideas, whether or not they are good or bad, because it's an alternative perspective that we may have not thought about previously. And who knows, it could be an idea that is leaps and bounds more successful than any other idea that anyone else is suggesting, whether or not you think it's stupid or not. There is no stupid idea or question necessarily. Um, but yeah, so like our phase two very much puts a lot on the candidates to work together to think and coordinate and come up with a plan to execute. And so we evaluate their ability to work as a team to think and plan. And then the second half of that phase two is now them executing it, where we embed our cadre to essentially observe and take note of how are they uh, demonstrating various TTPs that we're looking for. Like, do they have some level of experience? Because another thing with our team, and this isn't necessarily going to be the same for every team, obviously. Our team, we're looking for guys that have some experience under their belt, so we don't have to go so much into drilling into the basics and focus more on advanced topics, um, and spend a lot more of our training time on that. So part of our evaluation in that second part of phase two is evaluating what base level of certain TTPs they have some knowledge of, and also giving us a baseline of, okay, this is what we would need to correct going forward if it is the case. Um, and outside of that, a lot of it as well is the cadres are there to evaluate how they work together as a team. Uh, do they have personality issues that are contradictive to a good teamwork environment? Do they have an ego problem? Do they have failure of accountability? And all these various negative leadership traits or traits associated with both a bad leader as well as a bad team member. Because what we really focus on is accountability, um, and and the drive to want to continuously improve. So we really look for people who, like I said, demonstrate those traits, and we really take note of negative traits like ego problems or uh, lack of, I guess, communication skills. Or uh, eh, I could go through a list if you really wanted me to, and I could pull up a list of various traits that we evaluate if you wanted me to go into detail with that. Um, and we take note of those. And that's basically our phase two evaluation. And at the very end of phase two, we make the candidates do a peer review to see how they criticize their fellow teammates. Because one thing we try to push is everyone should be open to criticism. However, there is a manner in which you should go about offering criticism to someone, that being in a constructive manner, constructive criticism. And we heavily focus on, if you're going to criticize someone about something, you better offer a suggestion of how to improve following that criticism. Otherwise, what are you doing at that point other than just complaining? Like, you're not offering any solution to the problem that you're, quote, observing. And so that's another thing that we're evaluating at the tail end of that phase two assessment. Um, and so, yeah, phase two, all about obviously their ability to, their critical thinking skills, as well as their ability to work successfully in a teamwork environment, uh, demonstrating various character traits. Which, like I said, I could pull up a list if you want me to go into detail of like what types of character traits we're looking for. And then phase three, we do a final board interview with the selection staff, and we bring the candidates in one by one to sit in front of the board, which is all of the selection cadre as well as the staff of the team. And we put the guys on the spot. We basically, for lack of a better way to describe it, grill them on their mistakes. And the reason we do this is we now want to evaluate how well do they take criticism and how do they react when being put on the spot like that, both to evaluate them in somewhat of a stressful environment like that, as well as, like I said, how they take being criticized. Because we don't want guys with ego problems that are set in their ways necessarily and refuse to accept that there is potentially a better way of doing things. Because our guiding principle with our unit is adapt and overcome. There's always a way to improve and continually better how we are doing things. So if they pass that criticism assessment, um, essentially, because that's what the phase three is very heavily tailored around, is the criticism assessment. We also ask questions in regards to TTPs because we want to reevaluate if they're on a uh, an experience skill basis as well, just because that's the type of unit we are. We're looking for guys that still have that base level, so we don't have to spend so much effort and time into developing somebody from nothing, because it's a lot more difficult for us with our operational tempo. So, but yeah, so that is essentially how I've identified the best way to evaluate and select for various different character traits, at least. And it's so far succeeded for me. Every candidate that I've produced with this selection class has been very driven and eager to continuously develop themselves as well as the team towards a continuing standard of continued training. And on top of that, the guys we have are very dedicated and fucking are pretty close knit, and because of that, so it's it's worked so far at least, and had any I haven't had any bad eggs get through so far. Cross my fingers. So, but yeah, if that answers that, I guess, question for you.
Yeah, so yeah, that's good. As far as like an overall thing, I want to bring this up to a higher level. So that's a very that's a more tactical level. Um, but to give, I guess, some perspective to individuals that aren't doing Milsim, I'll say that basically I brought this up before, I think in a previous conversation, or in a VC that we were in about systems. Um, I went on a cruise recently and I spent a decent amount of time um in the cabin reading a book. Um
As
um
one does.
yeah, as one does. Um and it's called The Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman. And in part of it he talks about systems. And I already knew this concept of systems. I knew of this honestly since I was like in elementary school, like maybe sixth grade, fifth grade. Um, but I didn't really know exactly that this was called like systems. But I knew that there was like this. I know you had like these inputs, these happenings inside of a system, and then outputs, and that all these different things were connected in different ways. Of course, as a 12-year-old, 11-year-old, I didn't really have a complex understanding of all sorts of systems. It was just like small things. But um, and then additionally, with my college education as a computer science major, you learn about systems. And coding is all about inputs, doing stuff with the inputs and then outputs. So I started thinking deeper about systems and then reading about it in this book. I want to give the chapter so then people know. Yeah, it's chapter 9, chapter 10, and chapter 11. But basically, when it comes to this, getting the right people, it's what you said there of initially identifying the culture that you're striving for, the identity, and the type of people and the characteristics that will create
Enable.
and enable that identity and that culture that you're trying to build. And in my opinion, that's the output of your assessment or your recruitment system. Your input are the individuals coming in to your system, whether that's people entering your Slack server, your Discord server, your TeamSpeak, your brick and mortar business, whatever it is, that's the input. And then what you do inside that system, no matter what, you need to be outputting individuals that match those characteristics that you identified from the onset, or from the beginning. So I had a conversation with Iceman about his parameters when it comes to recruiting. And Iceman, that's his username, his gamer tag.
I know
But
who he
yeah,
is.
well, I'm explaining to the listeners,
Oh,
because they're
wow.
like, who the hell, Iceman? That's not a legal name. That's his gamer
You
tag.
don't know that. That could be his legal name. You could have changed it.
Yeah, but he's yeah, he's pretty knowledgeable about recruiting and getting the right people within, I guess, these military simulation games. So I was asking him about it, and he mentioned that for his inputs, he has some very strict standards. So then he'll have to do less on his end, internally inside the system to get the output. But if you have lower standards in the beginning, like you can have 0 hours of experience in this game, you can know none of the TTPs, your age could be whatever, then what you do inside that system will need to be different to get the same type of individual possibly. So understanding this like systematic approach is really important because for you, you get your people through, I'm guessing, an application, and then from there they enter the system, and then you have the interview, which is a part of it, and then they have the different stages of the ANS, and then at the end of ANS, then hopefully you have that individual that you want that has those characteristics. But when individuals are assessing, okay, how do I get like good people, do what you did of assessing like the type of people that you want at the end, and then create a system that analyzes and filters out the bad people. And
Yeah.
you can tell a lot about a community and what your future experience will be like in that community based on their recruitment and who they let in. I will never join a community and take it seriously. Well, me personally, I will never take it seriously if they let everyone in. Like if there's no filter, that system is literally an input. There's no like filtering, processing, and that's just like output straight into the community. If that's what it is, that it's probably not going to be the best place for me because you could probably imagine it's the internet. You have all sorts of people on the internet. Some are good, some are bad. Um, so it's a bit of a gamble as opposed to a community like yours where you put in a lot of work to, I guess, engineer it in a way to get the right people. And then the candidates themselves also put in a lot of work to represent themselves and to learn about what they're potentially getting themselves into. And at the end, you get good people. Or I mean, I guess that's subjective. You get the people that you're looking for your
Yeah.
community. So I just wanted to give that overall broad so then people can start applying that to other things, whether it's, I guess, a real life businesses or other types of gaming communities. But
Or
then,
even manufacturing. As
oh
as
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
you can even apply that principle there as well with trying to produce a product.
yeah.
So,
I mean,
but
there's in this book. I mean, I have it here with me. I mean, you can't really see it because it's focusing, but um, yeah, they talk about all sorts of stuff. It's the personal MBA, so they talk about it with like widgets and inputs and outputs and like yeah, they talk about it in the manufacturing way, but it can be applicable in all sorts of systems. And they talk about Charlie Munger, um, the very famous guy from Berkshire Hathaway, which is recently passed, but he thinks in systems and he attributes his systematic thinking, his lattice work of systems, to his success in business and in life. And I understand why. But yeah, I mean, there's that system, and then taking it even to how another business is doing this very, very, very successfully. There's this very rich billionaire called Robert F. Smith in the United States, and he runs a private equity company called Vista Equity Partners.
okay.
And he, what he does is he's a master of systems. Because he acquires businesses, injects his systems into that business, and then makes the business better. So
Yeah.
the systems that he knows, yeah, it's just all about like systems. Like how they hire and recruit people, they put them through these different aptitude tests. Um, well, they first do these aptitude tests on the people existing, on like their best coders, their best recruiters, whatever. They see like how they're scoring on this certain exam. They're like, okay, these guys are scoring high on this, low on this. And then they have their new applicants take that same exact test and see, oh, okay, they're matching pretty similar to our high achievers. So they might potentially, like, they have the aptitude to do the exact same thing, go along the same path of success. I mean, there's still some nuances, but yeah, just like this whole systematic approach to onboarding people, I think is very, very important. And it takes time and effort. Like, I know your recruiting, your ANS process takes a lot of time and effort because I got to be a part of it for a little bit. But yeah, I think it's worth it in order to get the right people because, as you mentioned, with your second iteration of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, if you bring in the wrong people and you don't check that often, then you could lose your community and it could turn into something that you don't want it to turn into. So this first like chunk of getting the right people and selecting the right people is something that is very, very, very important because it's harder to get rid of someone than it is to um not let a bad person in. You can easily just say, yeah, you're not in. Sorry. And they're like, okay, yeah. And that's easier to do than you have a member that already has like friends. They might have a clique, and you're like, yeah, you can't be in the community anymore. Like that's gonna have some higher ramifications.
Yeah, no, it definitely can, because then you're effectively ripping relationships apart, which has its own downsides, obviously.
Yeah,
But I definitely 100% agree with that outlook. I honestly I don't know if you're familiar with Alex Hormazi. Are
of
you?
course, of
I've
course.
started following him a lot more recently. And he talks a lot about how to, especially with a lot of how he talks about how building successful sales teams, identifying like what characteristics make a successful salesman, and then obviously with his system, he's dropping them in the environment and making them prove themselves in a specific period of time. If they don't display those traits or they don't make those sales within this period of time, then comparable to their highest salesman, um, then likely that they will turn out to be comparable. It's far less likely in the long term that you're going to get what you're looking for if that individual isn't demonstrating those characteristics from the get go. It's harder to teach somebody traits, especially character traits, because you can't teach someone how to think. Well, you can show them how to think, but you can't make them think that way. Is the biggest thing. It's the whole age-old saying: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Attribution. So um, instead of trying to form and mold someone into something, because that requires a lot more effort, and remolding someone's thought process is way more difficult than it is to just identify what those individuals are, and is costs a lot less resources overall to do so if you approach it from that avenue. Uh, no, I 100% agree with honestly, I didn't really think of it in that methodology of systems until you actually just brought it up. And you're completely right. You're really just creating essentially a a conveyor belt where you're putting uh, a resource in, and then at the end of the day, or at the end of the conveyor belt, getting the product that you are ultimately looking for when you create a system like that. So no, I agree 100%.
Yeah. I will say though that sometimes with this, like with the Hormozy sales approach of just like sink or swim, like
Yeah,
um
that's
that that works sometimes, but it's not the best approach always because like if you're trying to get someone that will perform exceptionally on day one, then that is a good approach. But if you're like trying to get someone that has aptitude for growth, then that is not a good approach
no, I
because
can
they will
agree with
most
that.
likely not perform as well as individuals that are in your company performing well. I mean, they might, but yeah, it. So I wanted to point that out because there might be someone that's like, well, Dwyer needs to shut his mouth because that's a bad idea. So I just wanted to bring
Don't get
that
me
up.
wrong. that it does have its flaws, and it's applicable in certain environments depending on what you're trying to do. So you're not wrong. I definitely wouldn't just suggest the trial by fire approach, especially when you don't already have an established when at least in the community space. Like if you don't have an established community and you begin with the trial by fire approach, you'll find it a lot harder to actually develop that community out. But no, I agree with you. It's just one method to solving a problem, but it has its better applications at varying different, I guess, scales within your community is, I guess, the best way I could elaborate on it.
Yeah. I
But I
mean,
figured I'd just throw that out there.
yeah, it's good. I like to have the toolbox of, I guess, tools approach of like having all these different things, like the sink or
Methods,
swim
yeah.
method. You have the more teach 'em up method. You have, I mean, all these different like tools and ways of doing things, and then know the best connections to make. Like, okay, I have this problem set. What tool or what method do I need to fix this problem? Like that. That's my approach.
Yeah.
Because if you, yeah, I mean, having an approach where, oh yeah, this is just the way. So I'm just gonna apply this to all similar. Like if I have a recruiting problem, I'm just gonna employ the sink or swim method. And if you don't make it, then it is what it is. That's just the way that it goes. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah,
I definitely wouldn't recommend that method if you don't already have something established because you will find yourself struggling to uh, build a baseline. Yeah, I definitely agree on that approach.
yeah,
Um, like you said, just various different tools in the toolbox.
yeah. Um, okay, so going back onto the timeline of the um, golly, is B Squadron, B Squadron.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I think you already started touching on it. So you eventually got to meet me at Task Force Nova, that military, yeah, that Milsim group, in Arma, and I think that came about because basically the head recruiter of that group reached out to you, and you were like, yeah, sure, and then you joined that group. But I guess I
It
kind
wasn't
of want.
exactly like that.
I want to hear like your perspective since I obviously don't really know what how that went down.
So essentially, the guy who is kind of in charge of the recruitment personnel there had come and saw my B squadron. So like my B squadron unit, ran for like 5 6 months, but then I had to take some time away, so I kind of put a pause on it because I had to focus on some other stuff in my life. But instead of handing that one off because it wasn't at a state where I could hand it off and expect it to be successful, I just stood that down instead. And focused on stuff in my real life. And then months later, I got a message from this guy who signed up to come, holy shit, to come join our unit and do our selection and all that. But he never actually properly did the selection process. But he came in and talked to us about it and learned a little bit of how we did things. Um, originally. And then months later, I get a message, oh, you run a CAG related unit. We're trying to set this up in our community. Would you be interested in doing it? This is our objectives with it. We want it to be more reconnaissance focused. So they want to do something in the G Squadron element where it's more intelligence gathering and AFO focused. So they're like, would you be interested in coming on board? And I'm like, I'm not going to say I'm interested in coming on board up front. I'm willing to come in and entertain a conversation about it and weigh out the expectations before I sign up for anything. And so I came in, and essentially it was like you guys or they walked me through like what they wanted the end goal product to be for, I guess, this group. They wanted it to be a small team that really focused on their capabilities within the niche that they were trying to fill. So, like the reconnaissance intelligence gathering aspect of it. And it needed to be a small team of guys that were capable of operating in this tempo where they didn't necessarily or weren't always going to have support. So that required a specific individual that really valued training, cohesion, and the ability to be adaptable in a very small team environment. And so essentially what I did was walked them through from start to finish. How would I build this sort of group? This is what I'd do for a selection process. This is now how I'd go about training them and walk them through like start to finish the building blocks of how to build this and then how to sustain and maintain it in the long run. And and that is kind of how the conversation was. And then they were very enthusiastic in how I explained it and gave my pitch, I guess, of how I would go about doing it. And then it evolved into, all right, well, since you guys want what I came and pitched you, then I and your community seems like they're open to allowing me to do this and giving me the freedom to do it how I need to do it to make it successful, then I'm willing to hop on board and come aboard and set this up for you. As long as you give me the free reins to do what I need to do with it to make it your end goal vision of what you want. And so, and that's how I got brought onto TFN was essentially to do that. Exactly how I explained it. And we did end up doing it. And for the time that it did run, I dare say it was pretty successful in what it set out to do in the short period that I was given to do it. Um, and hell, I met you and produced you within it. Not that I produced you, but I identified you and brought you into a team of like-minded individuals. And we did do some good work for the short time that we did do it. So
Yeah, I want to do an aside of the strategic importance of why. Yeah, because at the time I was an advisor to this group, and I understood, and I was thinking a bit strategically about how the community could last in the long run. And one of the problems that I noticed was that you would have individuals, because the unit or the community at the time was for newer players, because that was the owner's like main thing, is to allow newer players to come in, and like train them up and let them have a fun time and grow and develop in the game. So you'd have newer players, and then there was a roof that you could reach inside the community before you had to leave and go somewhere else. So one of my pitches to them was to bring in, or I guess to stand up this group with internally that would allow people that if they're trying to just keep going up, they wouldn't reach a ceiling where they would have to leave the like that community and then go to another one. They would just transfer to another group within the same community, so you still maintain the people. Um, so that was one of the pitches, amongst other things. I mean, the need for an element like that was necessary to. I mean, it was really
it,
necessary, but
it better enabled us to do the types of operations we were doing, where it was
yeah,
very dynamic and required us to gather our own intelligence, and then we weren't so handheld. So we
yeah,
needed a force that was independent enough to do that. Um, but no, I now that you say that, that does make a lot more sense because I didn't realize that that was the original pitch and reasoning to why you guys approached me for it to be the higher elevated group that was for those guys who wanted to go that next level of seriousness, cohesion, training, etc. I more so was coming in thinking, not thinking, I guess, that point of view, but more so the I'm here to fill a mission set point of view
yeah,
is how I approached it. But now that you say that, it does make a lot of sense looking back on on why I was approached, I guess. But
Well, that was one of my pitches. I don't know if that was one of the final reasons why they decided to like greenlight the idea, but it was one of the reasons that I pitched them
gotcha.
because I mean that's a problem if you have individuals in your community that are learning and playing and they're trying to like take it up a level or like take it up a notch as far as like seriousness. You want to be able to accommodate that. You want to be able to help the user or the player throughout their entire life cycle of like when they're brand new all the way up to like when they're very, very, very experienced. So that community at the time had the brand new people up to like mid level. And then if you wanted to like keep going, you were kind of shut off. Um,
Yeah.
so it was important to add in that second part so then we could allow more people to stay within the community instead of having those people leave. Because those people that want to get up to that next level are probably the people that you want to have stay in your community. So yeah, I mean, it just helped with recruitment. Well, I mean,
And it also
recruitment, yeah,
helps
and
with,
retention.
yeah, retention. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I was about to get to. Like, because at a certain point, if you don't offer that next level, then yeah, you lose those guys realistically because they're gonna go look for it somewhere else. So no, I completely agree with you on that regard.
Yeah.
But I mean, TFN was a fun experience while it existed. Honestly, I wish it still did. I wish it could have evolved into something. But that goes back to like what we originally were talking about with establishing your identity and then building your community up with people who match that identity. And I think that's what the initial failure with TFN is they brought in so many people that didn't like identify with any one specific thing. We had so many people looking for various different environments. And at a certain point, I think that was a contributing factor to why TFN is unfortunately not around till to this day. But
Yeah. I think it's a mistake that a lot of newer owners make because that was that owner's first time running a community. Um, yeah, being like the top person. So I mean they learned a whole bunch, but I think figuring out how you define success is important because a lot of new individuals that start these communities they define success as having a whole bunch of people. So they just like try and get as many people as possible, just any way possible. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, they'll DM you. They don't care if you asked to join this type of group. It doesn't matter. They'll DM you and see if you want to join anyway. Just to like get people. And it's like, oh, finally, we have like 200 people.
80,
It's great.
80 to 200
Yeah.
people. It's great.
And
Yeah.
then you realize, oh, wait a minute. All these people aren't trying to do what we're trying to do here. Um, which I mean that can also that's another problem. A lot of oftentimes they don't even know what they're trying to do there besides just create a community and just play the game. Which I mean there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that, but I think if you take it a step further and define what you're trying to achieve in the long run with a vision, define okay, how am I going to get there? Define the type of culture, the type of people I want to help get us there. If you do that, I think that will help you outlive the stereotype of um, I don't know a poor life span of these communities. But
Yeah. I mean, what's the
yeah,
average? 6 months, I think, is the average of like if your unit lasts longer than 6 months, then your likelihood of long-term longevity is exponentially goes up at that point. I think that's what the average in the community is because a lot of these units that don't fix a lot of these flaws within that time period, typically around the 6 month period, start to exponentially go downhill. At least that's what my observations are and what I've noticed.
I for me I noticed this trend of a honeymoon period, and this concept is applicable everywhere. Like if you get a new job, you're going to be happy about it for like an X period of time. You start a
Yeah.
business, you're going to be happy about it for an X period of time. Like even if some bad stuff happens to you in that like honeymoon period, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. This is great. And So I think communities go through that initial phase of the honeymoon period of like, oh, we're starting the sub, we have our own thing, we're like, we have our own cool mods and all this fun stuff. And then after the honeymoon period, and then problems come up, that's when people realize, oh, I actually have to work kind of hard at this to keep this thing alive and afloat, and work on some different weaknesses that I have, or I don't know, whatever. And a lot of communities are like, I I can't really do it. Or they just like throw in the towel for whatever reasons. Whether it's because of that or, well, I guess financial is part of that. But I mean, financial is a big part of it, of them just not willing to um,
Continue to invest.
continue, yeah, funding. Or I guess not. I mean, it's not really an investment at, unless you're thinking
Well,
well
you
about
can.
it.
I mean, you can turn it into a self-sustainable thing at a certain point. Um, but obviously, we won't talk about finances because that's a whole different that's a whole different beast when it comes to the Milsim
Yeah,
um, environment. But yeah, no, I 100% agree. That's the honeymoon period. Honeymoon period is definitely something you can observe when it comes to these communities.
yeah. Um, yeah. So you were with Nova for a little bit until it um decided not to exist anymore, and then you ended up resurrecting B Squadron again, which is where you're at now. So I guess if you want to talk about what you're currently doing at B Squadron.
So yeah, B Squadron essentially is what it is. I mean, we are a unit that emulates one of the squadrons within the combat applications group. We very heavily focus on direct action, hostage rescue, and all the things within that mission set. And being a special missions unit and trying to emulate that, we put a pretty high focus on train uh, for success. And that's kind of the culture we're trying to build there. Um, it is still in its infancy in terms of reforming as a community. We're not by any means a large community. We're very small, but we have within our small size a handful of capable people who are really driven to try and build out what we are envisioning for the end state of this community to be. Um, and another thing with it is uh, I also am partnering with another group that split off from my group because I decided that instead of focusing on multiple aspects of the unit with having an aviation section and then our primary combative element or our assault element with being the CAG, like I decided I would much rather focus heavily on our CAG element and focus all my effort to that. And so I had my guy who's kind of oversaw my aviation split off and create a sister semi-independent group from us that specializes completely in aviation, air to ground, and AFSOC enabling elements like PJs. He also even just started a special reconnaissance element within there too. Um, and his whole goal with that group is to create a group that specializes in this field and then going out and finding other communities that either lack this field within their unit or could use some supplementation in coordinating joint operations to provide them with this experience. And so that's what he does with his group. But I use them myself to basically provide that whole experience entirely for me, and I don't maintain that to allow me to more focus on what I do want to focus, and that's on our assault element. Which so now I can hyper focus on turning that into the best uh, CAG assault troop that I can within the Milsim environment. And that's our focus, and we partner with them to do so. And our hope is that in the future, we can kind of do a little bit of what they're doing and coordinate with other units to offer what we can do to supplement other units, as well as even offer cross training opportunities, not only to offer other units training opportunities they might not have gotten in their unit, or alternative methods of doing what they're doing. But vice versa, for us to go out to other groups and see how they do things, to see if we can implement it where within us to better improve how we do something, just because we might have not thought of it, or we weren't doing something that way and it's proven to be successful in what they're trying to do. And so that's kind of like what I've been up to as of late, is a developing out my community, and then and hyper focusing on like what I want my ethos, mission statement, identity to be, and building that out while working with the other group to supplement us with the things that we're not focusing on. And so yeah, that's what's been going on with B Squadron essentially. But like I said, by no means we're not a large unit. We're really focusing on quality over quantity, and taking our time working with our guys to get them to where we want them to be. And at the same time, since we put so much development into our guys and value into our guys, in turn, they're very dedicated to our group because we put so much time into bettering them. Now they in turn want to help better us, and we really support our guys to the best of our ability, trying to breed that culture. But yeah, so I mean, if you have any particular questions directly in regards to what's going on there, I mean, feel free to ask. I don't know exactly what you would like to talk about in regards to it.
Um, I just think that what you're doing with no, there's a lot of opportunities that could come out of what you're doing with having the assault element be independent from the AFSOC element, or like the air aviation element, and allowing both groups to like interact with other groups.
More
Um,
independently.
yeah, because that can open up a lot of different opportunities going forward, and yeah, it's very neat.
Yeah, honestly, working with Bags is who runs the aviation group. Working with them is honestly like very mind opening, because in turn, since they're not attached to us, they can in turn hyper focus on what they're doing, become the best at what the heck they're doing. And I can tell you right now, when it comes to the aviation and air to ground space in Arma, I don't think anyone else is doing it better than them, realistically, right now. In terms of the TTPs and procedures that they implement, they very heavily focus on training to real life standard in that regard. And it is amazing to see the work that they do. What's really nice is they go out and work with other units in a multitude of different mission sets, so that their guys can get experience working with different types of units that complete different mission sets. So, like, they work with conventional units, soft units, all of the above, so they can get experience with working within all these different environments, and in turn come back and disseminate the new information they've learned to better improve themselves, so that way when they go out and work with other units, they're even better next time. And it's really neat to watch it happen alongside with my group, just watching it all unfold. And it's been pretty successful so far. We've gotten a couple groups partnering within that community we're trying to form with it, and it's definitely interesting, and I'm pretty enthusiastic of the future with
I have some ideas for you. Um,
it.
I'm contemplating if I want to say it on air. Um,
If you want,
so I
we
won't.
can talk about it personally, and
Yeah,
then if it ends up panning out in the future, we can do another episode and talk about
yeah.
it.
I'll do it when we're not recording. But yeah, there's a lot of really cool things that could come out of that. A lot of cool things that I wish are currently here. That aren't. Um, Even though I'm just a casual and I hardly play the game anymore. But um, they would still be cool nonetheless. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, I guess that brings us up to currently where you're at chronologically. Um, we touched on a whole bunch of stuff regarding leadership, um, a whole bunch of different principles that you have. Is there, let me look here. I don't, I think we touched on everything that I was wanting to touch on. Um, well, actually, there's one here. Okay, so the future of Milsim. Where, so I mean, there's obviously going to be some games going out, um, and yeah, some games coming out that are not going to be Arma that will eventually be better than Arma. Fingers crossed. And whether, yeah, I mean, whether that's tomorrow or if that's in 5 years, it will happen. So I'm curious about what you think the future of these type of milsim online communities will look like, not specifically for like Arma, but for these type of games overall.
I definitely think, at least looking at the trends of like where a lot of these games are going, it's a lot more focused towards realism and less of the casual space. Especially looking at a lot of the games that are coming out that I've been following. I don't know if you want me to plug games that are in development in here or not.
Oh, I
I'll
mean,
leave that.
you can. That's fine.
Um, but I'm involved with a pretty close friend of mine who, or I can't say close friend of mine, but a guy that I've been involved with in the Arma community for a while. I consider him a friend. He is a pretty well-known mod developer in the Arma community. He, as well as another multitude or a multitude of other well-known mod developers, have gotten together and formed a game development studio where they're trying to develop a game within the space of military simulators that Arma falls into, it being a sandbox sort of environment for Milsim. Because there's kind of like a split in where the Milsim community is going. There's like the games like Operator, Ground Branch, Ready or Not, where they're less sandboxes and more of like a, I don't know how to explain it, like a structured experience that's already structured for you, and you don't have as much freedom within it with the sandbox environment. And there's people who are doing milsims in those space where they're not focused more on the sandbox aspects of building out missions and stuff, and more in the, we're just gonna really focus on tactics and implement them in these environments that are already made for us. And then there's the sandbox environment still, where you got Armor Reforger that's actively in development and continuously implementing new features. And then you have this game that I was talking about. It's called Fire Team. Is the working name? Well, that's the name of the game right now. And its whole focus is more on realism, where Armor Reforger is kind of sticking to keeping it more generic, I guess, with not tailoring it towards realism specifically. But there's obviously communities within that are developing mod content to start to shift towards that, like Arma 3 did. When Arma 3 released, it was a base blank slate that mod developers slowly over time developed, so that way, the game is more acceptable towards guys that are more looking for casual experience than guys who are looking for a realism experience. But then there's this other game in development which has a lot of features that are more focused towards the realism niche with a lot of what they're implementing, but it's also implementing a lot of revolutionary stuff that hasn't been like in the space of the Milsim sandbox games, like some of the destructible environments stuff they're working on, and a lot of the features that they're working on. They're even implementing some RPG-esque features, like with character customization. They have a character editor that's similar to like one would be in Fallout 4. Gear customization is similar to what you're seeing in games like Operator and Ground Branch, where you can customize loadouts to your equipment, like down to moving pouches. They even plan on allowing you to even do the routing for the wiring for your push to talk and your communication headsets and stuff on your gear. And there's that game, which I'm very excited and anticipating. Hopefully, it's going to get into a testing branch here within that towards the end of the year. I'm hoping, but I'm pretty involved or I can't say I'm involved with them, but I keep tabs pretty closely, and I'm uh, pretty close to some of the people involved with development there. And so I'm excited for that, just because I'm a player who likes the realism side of things, and that game is more tailored towards those folks. Where Reforger is kind of going for the jack of all trades thing when it comes to the sandbox Milsim games. But then, like I said, you also have the other half of the future of Milsim, where it's going towards the more of those operator ground branch style games. Those have been coming out a lot as well, and you have that space. But I don't personally think Milsim is dying by any means. There's some people who will say that. I personally don't. I still see plenty of young people still getting into Arma. The amount of new players that are coming into Arma, especially the young folks, are. I don't by any means think that Milsim is dying, like some people would say. I just think it's going through a wave of a new generation or so. And when we get new games coming out that kind of fill the niche of Arma, especially that are new and fresh, there's going to definitely be an uptick again. Um, right now, while we're waiting for those new games, the trend for groups is to focus on smaller compositions. So, like, you see more soft style units that require less people to feasibly operate. Um, and that's the current trend now. And then there's a handful of really large line infantry units that all of the people are kind of looking for that experience coalesce to. But there's not as many of those units anymore, just because there's not as many people in the community as there was 10 years ago. And there hasn't been an influx of people to really make up for that yet. But I definitely think when these new sim games like start becoming in a more of a final, like even Reforger now, the population of players over there is exploding now, just because the mod development scene's starting to pick up. So like I'm optimistic for the Milsim environment in terms of that. I just think we got a couple more years before we get back to the explosion that like with when Arma 3 released and started getting traction. So
Yeah.
that's my opinion, at least.
Yeah. I mean, part of it also has to do with real life things going on. Like Arma
That too.
3 was going on when the United States and all sorts of nations were fighting in the Middle East, and doing their things around the world. And now the U.S. is, I know, that whole big battle is not going on. I mean, there's still stuff going on, but like the whole big war over there is not going on. So
Yeah,
I feel
I
like
will
that might
say,
take part in part of it.
yeah, I will say that that is a fair point you bring up that I wasn't even just thinking about. Like if you see the uptick in communities of all involved with the Ukraine Russian war space, there's been a huge uptick in those communities lately, and there's tons of content coming out within that space now as well. So like no, it definitely correlates with events happening in real life. I 100% have observed that myself. Although I haven't really seen a whole lot of stuff in terms of like the Israeli Gaza conflict, at least when it comes to the Milsim space. So I'm not really sure what dictates what people gravitate towards, at least, or at least I don't see a predictable pattern with it. But but no, there's are the Milsim space by no means it will ever like die out. It just goes through its life cycle, like almost like a market, like a where you have its upticks and downticks depending on what's going on in the world. Um, so I that's how I view it, at least. Um, no, that's what I got to say on that.
Cool. Okay, so we'll wrap this up here. Um, but man, let's see if let's just say I am wanting to be I want to start up an online community whether it's Arma or it's, well, an online gaming community, whether it's like Arma, Minecraft, Rust, 5M, whatever. What I mean, you just went through, I guess we just went through a whole bunch of stuff, but what type of advice would you give them off the bat, um, if I was considering starting up an online gaming community, like today after this call?
I would honestly suggest going out and looking for people who are already doing it successfully and just go talk to them and ask questions and get advice and suggestions and see how they're doing it and see if that in any capacity applies to what you're trying to do. I will not lie, you're going to get a lot of people who are going to tell you to either join their group or tell you to screw off, for lack of better way of describing it. But there are people like myself and you in this community who do want to teach people and only want the community to grow. So if you go out and ask a bunch of people, your chances are you will find one person who is willing to sit down and give you their insights. And that would be my suggestion for someone who's trying to get into starting a community. Outside of just joining a community and spending a little bit of time learning from the inside how a group functions, that would be my suggestion if you don't want to go that route.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before, but you've taken the more like leadership approach to learning how to run communities. Um, so I guess like the top level, you can also learn a lot of these same things, um, by just being a member in a whole bunch of communities and just being a sponge and opening up your eyes and ears to like problems, um, like things that are going great, things that are going bad, and taking note of them. But
For sure.
I mean, like what we mentioned before, nothing beats actually doing it. So if your
Just
end
get out and do
goal,
it.
yeah, if your end goal is to run a community, then eventually like you should run a community sooner rather than later because the lessons that you learn will be invaluable. And I was telling this to the owners of Task Force Nova, their online community, and like it was their first time basically running a community in that unit. Well, Task Force Nightfall. It was their first time running a community in that, um, I guess, game or in that area. So I told them that yeah, they're likely gonna fail. Which I mean, they eventually did. But the key thing is just to fail forward. I guess is a common thing that's said, fail forward, and just get better on each iteration because your chances of doing it very, very, very well the first time are not that high. Like even in the startup world, there's a whole bunch of people, like a bunch of these people that are running these billion-dollar companies, or have these very successful startups. It might not be their first startup. Like they had like a couple that failed, um, and they learned a lot, or they were, yeah. So just getting out and actually just doing it and starting it and learning is important. So yeah, I
For
want to
sure.
put that out there again. Um, well, do you have any final comments or anything that you wanna put out there?
Just get out there and play and be open to just new experiences in whatever community you want to be part of or do. And just be a good person realistically and don't be so set in your ways and treat people with respect, treat people how you would like to be treated. I guess that will be my closing statement.
Yep. Cool. All right, and then if people want to reach you, um, like, hey, this Dwyer guy is pretty cool. I want to join his unit, or I want to DM him and ask him for some assistance on something. How would people be able to reach you?
You can reach me on Discord, just simply d.dwyer, and I'll give that to Hayes so he can list it somewhere. If you want to join our community, if he's interested in sharing the link to that, that's an option. Alternatively, you can connect to me through one of Hayes's communities, whether it's his studio if he decides to publish that, or uh, any of those avenues. But feel free to reach out to me directly through Discord. That's probably the best way to get with me outside of joining one of those communities I aforementioned, obviously. But yeah,
Cool. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Dwyer, for this talk. This is probably the longest one. I think it's longer than Iceman's conversation because I believe Iceman was the longest one that I did before. But I think this is the longest one. So thank you for your time and thank you for the insights. I learned a decent amount, both about you and your journey, and then also about, I guess, how to better run online communities. So yeah, thank you.
no problem. I thank you for inviting me, honestly. And I can't say I came out of this not learning something myself. So for sure, and it's always a pleasure talking with you, Mr. Hayes. Always very insightful. So definitely, and I look forward to maybe getting together again for a future conversation as some new things may have evolved.